How would you summarize what you really wanted to do with the book?
What I wanted to do is something that I have spoken about for years and years. And I was always criticized, actually, for this idea. That is my point over really many years, was that the Shoah can be narrated, historically explained, conceptualized. Yes, one could do all that. But at the core of such an extreme event of systematic extermination of millions of people with a kind of goal of killing everybody and bringing people from all sides of Europe and the German conquered world to places built only for the killing of human beings. This had something at its core which was not incomprehensible, but which created a reaction of disbelief the first time or every time you faced it. Something in your belly which said, well, this cannot be. And then you give the historical explanation. So my aim was to, when I started to think about writing this history, to write this integrated history with all the angles, particularly putting the victims' voices into this history, the perspective of the victims, but also of the onlookers, of surroundings, of course, the perpetrators, the whole machinery. To write all this according to all the rules of historical narration, and at the same time manage to create in the reader these moments of disbelief. Now, the question was, how? It's not if I exclaimed, how terrible, how incredible, that I did find the answer, I think, by simply interjecting the voices of the victims, at least on many occasions. They themselves were often faced with things they couldn't, somehow they could not believe at first glance. I don't speak of their own deaths, of course, that we know only of the Sonderkommando seeing what was happening and writing it down. But things where they saw even in the streets of ghettos and so on, where their shriek, let's say, their shouting to the void was really heart-rending. And that document, this kind of documents interspersed in the narration, the very distant narration in a way, created in the reader, or should create, or hopefully created in the reader, this moment of identification in a way with the victim and seeing the scene as something for a moment. I don't say that this continues throughout the reading. For some people it does, but you then go back to the mechanisms. But you see, what I felt was really missing in the history of the Shoah, as it has been written by many from different angles, was simply this. It was more and more the history of a machine of death that in itself could create some thoughts. But the historiography, as we saw it over the decades, flattened the events, domesticated them. And what I wanted to reintroduce in a very precise history, and a very detailed one, was these moments of incredulity, of disbelief, incrédulité in French.
How does working on such material for 2 decades influence your life? What happens to you? What happens to your friendship, your family? What?
It's not 2 decades, Frank. It is. I mean, I started working on the Shoah consciously, let's say, from the book on Pius XII, which certainly created a lot of turmoil, and then went on taking different aspects and not finding really the focus of my major work then until late. But I have been in this material, in these topics, for 40 years or something like that. But it's true that when I started this work, it took me 16 years, more or less, from start to finish. It became the only task in my life. I mean, I had to continue teaching. In the meantime, I had even a heart operation and things like that, but that's force majeure. But it became my obsession. Day and night, I would wake up at night and think. And, I have it influenced me from all sides. It brought back things that I had not thought about for long. And I was visualizing, of course, a few elements which I would have preferred not to visualize. But basically, I was like, that explains why there are 2 volumes, because I wasn't sure I would manage to write the whole thing, either physically or psychologically. So I decided to cut it in 2. The first volume I knew I could handle more easily because it really went from 33 to 39. It was the pre-Shoah, if you wish. And once this was done, I did tell some friends in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, some historians who work and lived there, Israel Gutman and Yehuda Bauer, that I was stuck, but not because I was unable emotionally to go on, but I was stuck not knowing how to organize these various angles, these various levels. I hadn't found in a way the way of doing it. And in a way, they didn't laugh, but they smiled, let's say, saying, well, we told you this is unfeasible in a sense, what you try to. And for a while I was paralyzed by the method more than by the content. But once I found my way, I did other things, but I was really like I don't know how to describe it, but there was nothing that nothing would stop me, except not being able ultimately to finish, but I did.
Did you speak with your children about this work of yours?
Very little. I think the 3 of them read the 2 volumes at each phase, but certainly Eli, my eldest son, read it. I think David also. Whether Michal, my daughter, read it through, I don't know. I think she did, but I do not know. And I didn't speak with them about it, as I generally didn't speak with them except if they asked about this period. I mean, they knew my autobiography, of course, but it's not, contrarily to many families who have gone through where the parents or the grandparents had gone through the Shoah. This was not a topic touched upon in ordinary conversation in the family. Never, actually. I didn't volunteer any stories, obsessively, as many of survivors do. My children, of course, knew about what I was working, but we didn't discuss it. When the memoir came, I asked them if they allowed me to publish it, and yes, they did, of course. But, and they read it, I think, with great emotion. But this was not a topic of, it was not a current topic of discussion. Even, I would say it was very rarely touched upon.
Now, I have something I wonder about when you speak about this enormous amount of material. How do you organize that? How do you organize the research for it? How do you file it? And how do you make your choices?
Yeah, this is complicated. And I don't work as I should work. That is, no, not as I should work, but I don't work the usual way because it was too much. You see, I was well aware of the framework. I had studied it, I had read about it, I had worked on it, I had, in my small corner, lived it. The history was in my head, not from all the angles and from all the material, of course not. It took me then, after I knew I had it in my head, it took me 16 years to do it. I had a method of work which can be used only if you already know the main lines and know what should be the central idea, the victim's voices, the many voices, the many angles, the many levels that integrated history, and of course this sense of having to create this sense of disbelief. So what I did, and I wouldn't recommend that to anybody, certainly not to any student, was going in circles. That is, I would write a whole part, practically without looking at a book, just leaving places where I knew I wanted to look at diaries and so on, but kind of sketch. And then I would integrate the material that came to my mind, which I knew already, and then I would rework it. I mean, I don't know how to type on a word processor, so I had somebody. I wrote everything in longhand and gave it to somebody to type. Over the 16 years, many people have typed, students and others and professionals. And each time I would get the typed copy, I would redo the circle. And I would work that way in concentric circles, adding more and more material, changing the place of the material, until I sensed I could do it. It's not 3 times. I could do it 26 times, 40 times, going round and round. And it had something, I hesitate to say that, but the method was more reworking a literary manuscript than going systematically with historical material which you first collect and then you build the narration, because it was impossible to do it that way.
Were you collecting material still while you were writing?
Yes, all the time.
All the time?
All the time. That is, I was writing, and then I was reading. I had piles of books which I read, and mainly the things I knew, my knowledge of the field was pretty considerable. And so I knew where to look. I was not a beginner. It's not a field that I discovered. It's a field well known, which I reorganized in my way, or reconceived in my way. And therefore I knew where things had been written. I knew where I had to dig more because very little had been written. And of course I discovered a lot by reading these hundreds and actually thousands and thousands of articles, of books. And
where did you find all those diaries?
In Yad Vashem, in Yivo, in centers of... I didn't use manuscripts. I used published diaries, but many of those diaries were published in languages which are not translated in Hebrew. Well, of course, you had diaries in languages I couldn't read, but I would find them in Hebrew. A lot of those diaries were translated into Hebrew and then had practically no readership except the famous ones. But I could read them in French. I couldn't read them in Dutch, but that was usually translated into English or Hebrew. Like Moshe Flinker, this Dutch boy of a very religious family. The family and the boys fled to Brussels. Some of them, like Flinker and like Ringelblum, I think, and like Kaplan in Warsaw, wrote in Hebrew. A very archaic Hebrew, but they wrote in Hebrew. And Flinker, who was 15 then, wrote a remarkable diary. He also perished in Auschwitz, which existed in Hebrew in the way he had written it.
Coming back to Nazi Germany and the Jews and the methodology you developed for it, is that methodology applicable to other subjects?
Well, in principle, it should be applicable to any extreme events. It's not something that is... it should be applicable to... it's not a new form of historical narration, but I would say that it, until now, not used very much in that systematic way. And it really makes sense for extreme catastrophic events where masses of human beings are in a desperate state or in the process of being killed. If I could think of, I would say that even if we don't get to mass killings, if I had to write a history, well, of course, of the Armenian genocide or of Rwanda, I would use that same method. Also, of course, there is a difficulty in the case of both the Armenian genocide and Rwanda. Many of those killed were not necessarily people who had over time written down diaries, you see. Mm-hmm. So there can be material constraints, but the idea of integrating the vision of the dying or of the persecuted and the dying into the narrative as an essential element, but at the same time looking at it also from the perpetrator's viewpoint and from the surrounding society. It may be difficult in the situations I mentioned because of the lack of, let us say, documentation. After all, this is essential. If there are no diaries, if there are no letters and so on, and letters are very important, you cannot do it. Also, you must look for roundabout ways of achieving the same result. But in the case of Nazi Germany and surrounding Europe, and the Jews, by definition, mostly literate people, not all, but many of them, or most of them, you have this abundance of reactions to events which took several years, and therefore it was feasible. But it should be applied, I think, to extreme situations as I described them.
Do you know of other historians who use the method?
Not really, because I really didn't look for it. But many historians, I'm sure, try to look at a situation mainly when they try to give a kind of full description, integrated description. I mean, one of those who described everyday life in that way. But then, of course, there was no political level is Huizinga. In the waning of the Middle Ages, you have the sense of the picture being seen from all directions, you see. Burckhardt, to take the classics, right, in the history of the Renaissance and so on, in Italy, you have a few merging perspectives, but here it was really, there it's more, it's the beauty of it, here it's the horror of it, and the necessity of it also, I would say, almost on a, well, it simply otherwise the history is incomplete. It's simply incomplete. And I speak of the narrative level, right? The conceptual level demands ideology, demands centrality of Adolf Hitler and things like that.
How was the book received in Germany?
Very well. Very well. Astonishingly well. There was not one major negative critique. And all the papers came out a few days after the publication with major articles praising the book. And the Germans mainly, of course, noted this dimension of the victims' voices because they were used, and we all are used, those who follow the historical literature on the Shoah, to the more and more intricate and more detailed description of the perpetrators and of the system of extermination, of persecution and extermination. You have extremely detailed work, not only the classic work of Raoul Hilberg, but then monographs who deal with these and these security, police actions here and there. It goes into the smallest details. I mean, it almost is a problem, I would say, because, you know, it's a problem psychologically, and I would say almost it becomes a historical obsession to know practically the name of every SS commander everywhere. You know, sometimes it's unnecessary, but we have this extraordinarily detailed history of the perpetrators, let's call them that way. We have then locally, for France, for Holland, for each country which this has covered, the history of local reactions. And this has evolved over time quite massively. When I was a student and read the history of Vichy, or when I taught it at the beginning of my teaching years, the book usually used was by Robert Aron, not Raymond Aron, Robert Aron, L'Histoire de Vichy. And there you had, I think there was not even a page on the deportation of the Jews. Today it's exactly the obverse. I mean, the anti-Jewish persecutions and the deportations are central to histories of Vichy. So it took tens of years to change the perspective, but today you have that really as a central event. So you have that for France, you have that for Holland, and so on. And of course for Eastern Europe in even more details. But these are, again, policies of the government, of Vichy, and for reasons which are important to the local, to the local readership. They want to know, they want to see more and more with time the horror of their own behavior, let us say.
Do you have the impression that it helps the Germans to come to terms with their own past?
This evolution, of course. I think the Germans more and more, I was in Germany in the 50s. I'm trying now, well, briefly, but I was in Germany in the early 60s. Then every few years I spent time in Germany for the various works. Various books I was writing, and longer time in Berlin in the 80s, and then, of course, now very much so for those 2 volumes. The change is remarkable among the young Germans I meet. I mean, today you would ask me where I find the most attentive and the most understanding, that is, grasping, the best grasp of the situation. I would say it's among German student audiences. Now, on the street, I don't know. I didn't interview people ever. But among university audiences, or those coming to such meetings, very impressive.
So one question which you said, I didn't interview people. Did you interview people for Nazi Germany and the Jews, or did you only use written?
Only
written material.
Text. No, I interviewed in the past, and I mention it when memory comes. I interviewed Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, but that was my only interview for anything I wrote on the Nazi period.
Okay. I have some additional questions about the theme of representation as well. Do you agree with Claude Lanzmann's categorical rejection of the use of iconic images of the concentration camps when trying to describe the Shoah?
He, of course, pushed that to the extreme, and he's a master of the interview, let us say, of the slow interview also, which is remarkable in Shoah, and in the films that derive from Shoah, that is the shorter pieces on Sobibor and so on. It's difficult to answer because you would have to have an example to prove that both things can be done. That is, an interview in depth and flashing of not necessarily iconic, but yet documentary sequences or short sequences. I'm trying to think where this has been used in effectively, and if you go back much before Lanzmann, then you have the classics like Nuit et Brouillard, René, right? But then this is not really about. It is about the Holocaust or the genocide, the extermination of the Jews, but the word Jew never appears in Nuit et Brouillard. But these are images which stun, of course, the viewer, the torture places and so on in the camps. I think that Nuit et Brouillard has a shock effect, which is maybe the most intense of all movies, of all documentaries done on the extermination. Maybe there are short documentaries done in Eastern Europe, which I do not know, and which may have this. So I would say that by definition, the use of documentary material, that is, it should not be used according to Lanzmann's approach. I cannot say that because it could eventually be done with and it could eventually be integrated into a documentary which would use mainly interviews and so on. So I don't think this is an axioma. But it's true that the most impressive film to this day, with all the attempts done, from the period, I mean, from the 60s, 70s on, is Lanzmann's Shoah. Nuit et Brouillard is earlier, and Nuit et Brouillard, that was maybe the only possible method at the time, when things were not known and were not had to be really told A, B, C, D to the viewer.
But don't you think that possibly Lanzmann could not have made the film without the iconic images if they had not been shown before by René?
That's a good point, of course. You assume when you go and when you see Shoah, that in the back of the mind of the viewer, they are not necessarily the René images, but there are albums and albums of photographs about the extermination. And therefore, then you watch Lanzmann with that already in the back of your mind. That is, every question asked from a Polish bystander or from a German one, and not so many, brings back, even if you are not aware of it, those images you already know from the documentaries. Mm-hmm. Yes, you're absolutely right.
I wondered, what books and films about the Shoah do you hate or despise most?
There is a lot. There is a lot.
Which are the three
I
worst?
didn't think of that question, and therefore, but believe me, there is a lot. Well, I don't want to. Let me say that every few years there's a new batch of things that despise. I mean, I despise books which are manifestly attempting to be apologetic or whatever. This I despise, and I hate, of course. But things that were done, I think, genuinely, and yet are, to my mind, not despicable in a sense that would mean that the author or is responsible, but simply the product is bad. Any attempt really to to fictionalize the events annoys me, I must admit. I won't speak even of the latest, most famous, that is Littel's Les Bienveillantes, which I disliked for many reasons, although I must admit that the author has a extraordinarily strong talent as a narrator, and certainly I'm sure he meant to do something very strong and positive, and it has been also seen that way. In France, for example, he got the two greatest prizes you can get for a literary text. So all that being said, I personally didn't like the book. It's not a matter of despising it. I admired the ability to narrate and the mythological levels, but this is not something that is historically. He has read an immense amount, and the book certainly has no major mistakes. That's also not the point. But the need to look at the events through the eyes of a repentant, non-repentant, he says, opening sentence, je ne regrette rien, which of course is a famous song. The scatological dimension of the book, scatological, not eschatological, and the mythical, the Greek myth, and of the myth of Greek tragedy entering into it, give it, by the way, an interpretation which, to my mind, is, it's fate that has brought him to this. He kills father and mother, and he, Greek tragedy, what could you do? You were there, brought into it by fate, ananke, fate. So I don't like on a lower level, Sophie's Choice I disliked profoundly. Again, it was a great success, and a movie which was successful and so on. I disliked it. I don't like fictionalization of such extreme events. I can understand that there can be sometimes theoretically, there can be strong fiction, but I really, that's also very subjective, I must say.
Okay, the other way around. What books or films or works of art about the Shoah touched you most and, in your opinion, best evoke our common history?
If I take now together the various mediums, the various media, in film, I would say I was shocked because it was one of the earliest that I saw by Nuit et Brouillard, of course Shoah, which I saw many times. Incidentally, in parentheses, one of the productions which I disliked most was Zimmerberg's Our Hitler, but that was not directly about the Shoah, but about the Nazi phenomenon in general. Among the books, it all depends when you read what, you see. I cried, I must say, and I rarely cry, actually never, but I cry in films and movies, in films and some books. I cried reading the end of Le Dernier des Justes, But today I couldn't reread, of course, Le Dernier des Justes. I never tried, but you know, it was the 50s.
It was on my list to ask you.
Yeah, and I know Schwarzbart also. I met him several times. And I read Le Dernier des Justes and cried at the end of the book when they entered the gas chamber. So you see, the emotion or the response is not necessarily what today, in 2010, I would consider a book that would be exemplary. So there are books, I would say there are very few. I read and reread Hilberg's Summa I learned it. I read it first time when it came out in 61. But the works of art, let's say, Shoah, surely, Dernier des Justes, because that was the time and that was my age and that was what somehow probably brought back.
What did you think of Sea Under Love by Grossman?
Sea Under Love is a wonderful book, but it is a wonderful book, but it is not really, I think, all concentrate. I loved, of course, the first part, which is with the grandfather and the Nazi beast, right, in the cellar. I certainly loved the introduction of Bruno Schulz in this in the novel, and but there were other parts I admired for their style and for the artistry. It's a great book, but I wouldn't consider this as a book on the Shoah. You see,
I would.
You would,
yes.
Yeah. It's a great book. It's a great book, no doubt. Yeah,
Okay.
I certainly liked it very much.